Okay, let's unpack this. We're jumping straight into a deep dive on U.S. China trade relations because things seem to have shifted.
Yeah, it shifted really fast. According to the reports you've shared, we went from a supposed truce to, well, renewed tension almost overnight.
Exactly. These sources, recent news reports, they're detailing accusations flying back and forth, and this is just days after what everyone was calling a breakthrough agreement.
It's pretty striking.
So our mission today is really to cut through the noise. What exactly was this supposed truce?
Uh-huh.
What are the specific accusations being thrown around now? And, what does this sudden flare-up tell us about where things actually stand?
Because the situation, as it's being reported, feels, well, urgent, intense even. Lots of uncertainty right now.
And what's really striking looking at these reports is how recently things seemed positive, like back on May 11th.
Right, those talks in Geneva, the report said they resulted in an agreement, a temporary pullback on those, escalating tit-for-tat tariffs.
Yeah, a pullback. The sources describe a deal where both sides agreed, apparently, to cancel some tariffs outright.
And suspend others.
Yeah.
For 90 days was the time frame mentioned.
The goal, explicitly stated in these reports, was to reduce those reciprocal duties, kind of dial things back.
And we even have specific numbers reported on the reductions, which seemed, well, significant.
Yeah, the reports indicate the U.S. agreed to lower its tariffs on Chinese goods pretty dramatically, from 145% down to 30%.
That's the figure cited. And China, in return, reportedly dropped its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods from 125% down to just 10%.
Wow. I mean, that sounds like a major de-escalation. On paper, at least.
It does, a real move towards, easing the pressure that had been building.
But then just, maybe 2-3 weeks later, this past Friday, the whole picture just changes completely.
Right, and this is where the U.S. side makes a really strong claim.
President Trump, he stated pretty unequivocally that China totally violated its agreement with us.
That was in a Truth Social post, wasn't it?
Yes. And he mentioned feeling like he'd made a fast deal to help China out of what he called a very bad situation.
And express that disappointment, yeah. That so much for being Mr. Nice Guy, quote.
It's very direct language. But interestingly, he didn't lay out the specifics right there in the post.
No, those details apparently came later from the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer.
Right. And Greer's clarification, according to these reports, is key. He's saying the violation isn't about those headline tariff numbers we just talked about.
No, it's about China supposedly failing to roll back other trade restrictions, things agreed upon under the deal.
Specifically, non-tariff barriers. That's the term used.
Exactly. So not just the taxes at the border, but other ways trade can be restricted.
Did Greer give examples? Like, what kind of measures are we talking about that China allegedly isn't removing?
He did. According to the reports, Greer apparently pointed to things like China putting some U.S. companies on blacklists and also restricting exports of rare earth magnets, which are, really critical components.
Critical for a lot of industries, right?
Yeah.
Cars, aircraft, semiconductors.
Absolutely. And Greer was quoted directly saying China is slow rolling their compliance.
Slow rolling. That's a loaded phrase.
He also called it completely unacceptable and said it has to be addressed. He emphasized the U.S. view that they did follow through on their side of the tariff deal.
And they're very concerned, was the quote, about China's lack of progress on these other measures.
Yeah, these non-tariff things.
Okay, so that's the U.S. accusation. Which brings us to China's reaction on Friday. What's interesting here, looking at the reports,
They didn't actually address the specific U.S. claim, did they, about violating the truce on non-tariff barriers?
no, not directly. Instead, they countered. They came back with their own demand.
What was that?
These reports say China urged the U.S. to cease discriminatory restrictions against China. And they called for both sides to jointly uphold the consensus reached back in Geneva.
Ah, so basically pointing the finger right back at the U.S.
Pretty much. And they got specific about their area of concern. A spokesman from their embassy in Washington, Peng Yulu,
Yes.
he stated China had repeatedly raised concerns with the U.S., specifically about what they call the U.S.'s abuse of export control measures in the semiconductor sector.
Okay, semiconductors. That feels significant, especially because the reports also detail recent U.S. actions right in that area.
Exactly. The U.S. already has restrictions on tech exports to China, right? And just the Wednesday before all this blew up, the U.S. reportedly paused more sales to China. Chip technologies, crucial chemicals, machinery. all related to semiconductors.
So China's pointing to that as a U.S. restriction that violates the spirit, if not the letter, of Geneva.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
Though Liu, the spokesman, did also note that communication had been happening since the Geneva talks.
He apparently characterized those initial talks as ending positively.
Right. But this is where the picture gets, well, really complex based on the sources we have.
How so?
Because while China is talking about continued positive communication, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he offered a very different take just a day before Trump's post.
Oh, what did Bessent say?
On Thursday, he reportedly said that the trade talks had actually become a bit stalled.
Stalled. That's quite different from positive communication.
Definitely. And Bessent's perspective, as reported, was that the issues are just so big, so complex.
That maybe the leaders need to get involved. Trump and Xi Jinping.
That's what he suggested might be necessary. Though he did apparently expect more talks, maybe even a call between the presidents in the coming weeks.
It's interesting, though. Bessent also reportedly expressed confidence. Said China would eventually engage when Trump makes his preferences clear.
Yeah, he cited their very good relationship, which seems maybe a bit at odds with the Mr. Nice Guy comment from Trump just a day later.
It does highlight the conflicting signals, doesn't it?
So putting all these pieces together, this very rapid shift from truce to accusations, what does this specific chain of events really tell us?
Well, I think it really underscores that the core tension isn't just about those tariffs you can easily put a number on.
Right.
Both sides immediately jumped to these, let's say, less transparent issues. Non-tariff barriers, export controls, blacklists, specific components like rare earths.
Things that are much harder to track and verify.
Exactly. It suggests that maybe lowering tariffs was the easier part, the headline. But the deeper friction lies in these other areas, these other practices.
And this is all happening, of course, against the backdrop of President Trump's overall trade philosophy.
Which, as the sources remind us, heavily relies on using tariffs as leverage to reduce trade deficits, push for Buy American, bring back manufacturing.
Increase tax revenue, yeah. And that whole approach is actually facing legal challenges right now here in the U.S.
That's right. The sources mentioned that ruling by the U.S. Court of International Trade,
saying he exceeded his authority with the tariffs.
Yes, though the White House appealed that. Yeah. And reports say a federal appeals court temporarily put the tariffs back in place while the appeal proceeds.
Trump's reaction to that lower court ruling was strong too, wasn't it? Calling it horrific, hoping the Supreme Court reverses it quickly and decisively.
Yeah, so there's domestic legal pressure happening at the same time. And the sources also briefly mention other related U.S. actions, like revoking visas for some Chinese students.
Just added more layers to the whole picture.
Definitely. It's not just about trade in isolation.
So, connecting this all back to you, the listener, the main takeaway from these sources seems pretty clear. Despite that brief moment of optimism after Geneva, the immediate return to really strong accusations from both sides right after that supposed truce has seriously ramped up concerns.
Concerns that trade tensions could easily escalate again. It just creates this cloud of uncertainty, doesn't it? For businesses, for markets, maybe even for consumers down the line.
Okay, let's just quickly circle back on the core conflict we've laid out here. We had this Geneva agreement, lower tariffs, looked positive.
Seemed like a step forward.
And boom, the U.S. says China broke the deal by not removing these other non-tariff barriers.
While China fires back, saying, hold on, you need to stop your restrictions, especially pointing at those tech export controls.
Right. And layered on top of that, you have these conflicting accounts about whether talks are even progressing or if they're stalled.
Yeah, one side saying communication is positive, the other saying talks are a bit stalled. It really highlights how difficult it is for them to even agree on the baseline situation, let alone solve the actual problems.
Which really brings us to a key question for you listening right now to think about. Given how quickly this truce seemed to just dissolve.
Yeah, unravel.
And how the focus immediately shifted to these really complex, harder to define trade barriers beyond just tariffs. Does this suggest that the fundamental issues, the core disagreements between the U.S. and China on trade, are just too deep for these kinds of temporary fixes?
Or perhaps is this just how high-stakes negotiation works? You know, lots of bumps, lots of back and forth as part of a much longer process.
It's hard to say. But the sources definitely leave you wondering, what happens next if these tensions do keep ratcheting up from here? Where does it lead?